Greetings and welcome. This is Jed Distler, and this is the Piano Maven, which is your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. I had a suggestion from a listener that I devote a podcast episode to that humongous box set released a few years ago that contained the complete recordings by the Turkish pianist Idil Biret. Well, it's not quite a complete edition of Idil Biret's recordings because many items have been released since that box set came out. But I can't think of another single pianist who has recorded so prolifically, except very possibly for Vladimir Ashkenazy. Actually, he may have been much more prolific because if you count his recordings as a conductor, that would certainly add a lot of discs to a set. But this Idil Biret box set was a limited edition of 130 CDs and 4 DVDs. Now, I thought that on one hand, I could just do a podcast episode where I breeze through the box and I just do these very quick comments. Like, here's our complete Beethoven concertos. Nah. Okay, here's the complete Beethoven sonatas. Meh. Here's the complete Chopin piano music. So-so. Here's the complete Brahms piano music. This one is great. Here are the Rachmaninoff concertos. Really, really good. Here are the Hindemith concertos. I could have done something like that, and maybe you would have been satisfied. But realistically, I thought it would be more useful for collectors and piano mavens if I could draw up a list of some of Idil Biret's best recordings, ones that give a well-rounded view of her discography. But also, these are releases that I have greatly enjoyed in the past and that I continue to enjoy. So let's begin with the music of Beethoven. I've spoken before on this podcast about Idil Biret's release on the Finidar label that contained Beethoven's Pathetique and Hammerklavier sonatas. And these are really strong and vividly detailed and interestingly characterized readings that I think have a lot more vibrancy and shape than in the remakes that she did for her complete Beethoven cycle for her own label. So that is a release to consider, the original Finidar release of the Beethoven Pathetique and Hammerklavier. And you can find that on Idil Biret's own label distributed by Naxos. Although Idil Biret's complete Chopin cycle is one that I find kind of uneven, I gave it a fairly good review years and years ago, and I just find that not all of the performances have been holding up equally as well for me. But she does give a very scintillating and quite stylish performance of the rarely heard Krakowiak for piano and orchestra. I think this is one of that work's very best recordings. I should talk about the Berlioz Symphonie Fantastique in the Franz Liszt solo piano transcription. This was a big showpiece for Idil Biret, and she made this transcription's world premiere recording. I think it was in 1979, certainly the late 70s. And again, it was for the Finidar label. It's a colorful and virtuosic performance that totally takes the music's quirkiness into account. And I find that this premiere recording that Idil Biret did for Finidar is even more incisive and energetic than in the remake that she did for Naxos, which is still very good in and of itself. But it's this first version that's definitely the one to get. It's a wonderful recording. However, one of Idil Biret's best recordings of anything contains the 3 piano sonatas of Pierre Boulez, and this was on Naxos. I think it came out in the mid-90s. And her command of the notes and her feeling for long lines and her feeling for narrative sweep count for a lot. She really understands what to convey in this music. And whether or not you respond to the strict, total serial 12 tone language of the young Boulez, Idil Biret makes a very convincing case on this composer's behalf. Idil Biret's cycle devoted to the complete piano works of Brahms is probably her most consistently satisfying cycle devoted to one composer. If I had to pick just one recording from it to represent on this list, it would be the Piano Sonata number 3 in F minor, Opus 5. In many ways, her interpretation is modeled after the one by her teacher and mentor, Wilhelm Kempff. I am talking about the kind of clipped and angular passage work, and also her strong attention to bass lines and her very discreet pedaling. It's a very line oriented reading, but there's a lot of energy and power. Also, like Kempf, she really feels the second movement Andante Espressivo as two beats to the bar rather than a heavier four beats to the bar. And some people might find her brisk and sometimes unyielding approach maybe not as tender or as expressive when you compare it to the slower performances by people like Claudio Arrau. Also, I should say that Idil Biret's very first recording of the Paganini variations of Brahms from the early 60s is great fun to hear. It's purely unabashed and untrammeled virtuosity. The dynamic range is kind of limited. I think it's all kind of mezzo forte to forte, but it's kind of a machine like recording. But I enjoy listening to it just because the virtuosity is way over the top. I mean, not over the top like mannered, it's just the precision and the kind of typewriter like precision is kind of fun to hear. I mean, it's not my top recording of the Paganini variations, but I do get a kick out of it. And while we are on the topic of Brahms, I think that Idil Biret's recording of the Brahms Piano Concerto number 1 is one of the best in the catalog, actually. It's totally under the radar. Nobody ever talks about it. I reviewed it when it came out on an individual disc coupled with Schumann's Introduction and Concert Allegro. And I just pulled out my original review from classicstoday.com. And let me read it to you because I think this really describes what the performance is like. I wrote that if you are looking for a budget priced Brahms D minor concerto, I mean, I don't know if it's budget priced anymore these days, but if you're looking for a Brahms D minor concerto, consider this one. It's played with distinction, forethought, care, and real individuality. The tumultuous first movement is sculpted with broad rhetorical brushstrokes, yet never sags under its weight. Credit conductor Antoni Witt, who takes great care to shape and clarify the composer's difficult to balance orchestration. Idil Biret channels her considerable technique toward musical ends and admirably integrates the first movement's taxing chains of trills, descending octave thunderbolts, and upward scale passages into the orchestral fabric. So this is a really, really good recording. And also the Schumann Introduction and Concert Allegro has a wonderful performance here. The piano writing just soars like crazy. It's a marvelous performance. Among Idil Biret's recordings of Robert Schumann's piano music, I like her very sensitive and poetic readings of the Bunterblätter, Opus 99. It's very poetic and flexible playing, and the recording quality is a little bit on the dry side, but I think that kind of adds to the intimate aura of these performances. I really like them a lot. Idil Biret's cycle of the four Rachmaninoff concertos, which also were made with the conductor Antoni Witt, are well worth checking out. especially in the first and fourth concertos. And they just play the first concerto to the hilt and they bask in the virtuosity and emotional generosity of the music. And the fourth concerto is really great, especially with the orchestra. At the very beginning, those repeated brass and woodwind chords are so clear, but they're so beautifully balanced. And also listen to how Idil Biret just scampers through that final movement in the fourth concerto. She's every bit as playful as Earl Wild, and it's a really terrific performance. If I had to choose one release to represent Idil Biret in the music of Franz Liszt, it probably would be the second volume in a cycle that was devoted to some of this composer's works. This volume two contains the first versions of the 12 etudes that would eventually become the 12 transcendental etudes. These are really superb performances of these youthful efforts. And also, there are wonderful performances here of the three concert etudes Il Lamento, La Leggerezza, and Un Sospiro. And also the two concert etudes Waldesrauschen and Nobenreigen. God, these are beautifully, beautifully played, especially the Waldesrauschen. There's also a disc of Wilhelm Kempff's original transcriptions and compositions. This was on the Marco Polo label originally. And you know that Idil Biret is going to put her best efforts on behalf of her teacher. Kempff's music is kind of lightweight and old fashioned, but it's very sincere and beautifully crafted music. And Idil Biret plays his music and his transcriptions with obvious love and devotion. In the late 1970s, a handful of audiophile aware labels experimented with direct to disc technology, which meant that they bypassed the analog tape machine and they fed the recorded signal directly to metal parts on a disc cutting lathe, just like in the 78 RPM era. No splicing or inserts were possible, which meant that an entire LP side had to be cut in one continuous take, including pauses between pieces or movements in real time. And this could be very nerve wracking for sure. But the first direct to disc release by a classical solo pianist was actually by Idil Biret. She recorded this for Finadar in 1976, and she must have had nerves of steel to get through the session. And she must have relished the challenge because she is on tip top form on this recital. It includes two Chopin mazurkas, the A minor, Opus 17, number 4, and the B major, Opus 56, number 1. And these are much freer and imaginative performances than the straighter ones, relatively speaking, that she did in her Naxos Chopin cycle. She also plays the Scriabin 10th Sonata. It's not an explosive kind of performance like Horowitz. It's not like that pressure cooker kind of Scriabin. But the performance has a lot of half tints and very subtle dynamic hairpins that really beckon your attention. She also plays the Prokofiev Second Sonata, and this has great virtuosic aplomb, especially in the outer movements. Also, on the CD edition of this recital, there's a performance of the Seventh Sonata, which was not on the original direct to disc LP, but it's a great, great performance. And, there are little rushings here and there. I mean, come on, there was no editing, but still, it's a very well put together interpretation. Also, I wanted to mention a really nice concerto disc that originally appeared on the Alpha label that coupled Franck's symphonic variations with, of all things, the piano concerto by Jules Massenet. And this coupling later appeared in the big box. And the Massenet concerto is a work from that composer's youth, and it is certainly not the most tightly constructed piano concerto around. But it has great tunes and there's real sparkle to the piano playing. And the second part of the Franck Symphonic Variations features some really spirited and scintillating fingerwork from Idil Biret. There was also an interesting disc that came out a few years ago that contained three different recorded versions of Ravel's Gaspard de la Nuit, played by Idil Biret. There was one from 1965 that was recorded for the Vega label, but it was not approved at the time that she recorded it. But then she discovered an acetate LP master in her archive, and then she allowed it to be released alongside recordings that she made in 1974 and 1984. And I did a detailed review of this disc for classicstoday.com, and you can look that up. But it's a fascinating issue. I mean, just to have three different recorded versions of Gaspard de la Nuit on one disc, you don't get that every day. And I really enjoyed reviewing it, and I'm happy to have that in my collection. And now for my final selection from Idil Biret's big Naxos catalog. It's a 4-disc collection of works by 10 Turkish composers. Some of these works are for solo piano, others are for piano and orchestra, some are studio efforts, and others come from archival tapes. I'm not going to go into great detail to talk about these 4 discs or the composers or the works, but I thought that given Idil Biret's Turkish roots and her lifelong advocacy for the music of her country, one really should investigate this release because it's the only way to hear many of the pieces included on these 4 discs. And you can certainly check it out through YouTube or on all major streaming platforms. In fact, you can easily access all of the Idil Biret Naxos distributed recordings online. I also want to mention a live all Chopin concert that Idil Biret played in Ankara, Turkey on October 1st, 1999. Someone uploaded this recital to archive.org, and I've included a link to it in my episode description. This is a really interesting recital. It begins with a terrific reading of Chopin's Rondo alla Mazur, Opus 5. Then there's the Chopin Sonata number 3 in B minor, and it's a spirited performance that I like, although there are some signs of struggle and some overpedaling in the finale. There are some impetuous renditions of the second and third impromptus. There are flexible and poetic readings of the C sharp minor, Opus 50, number 3, and A flat major, Opus 59, number 2 mazurkas. And I think these are a little more imaginative than the ones in the studio Naxos recordings. And finally, there's a performance of the Tarantella in A flat, Opus 43, that almost races off the rails. It's a little too fast, but it's a lot of fun to listen to. But still, I have to say that this live all Chopin concert catches fire in ways that Idil Biret's solo studio recordings of Chopin did not, or did not consistently catch fire, let's put it that way. So I've recommended what I think are some of the best of Idil Biret's vast number of recordings. And it's a good place to start on my list when faced with such a massive discography. You have to say that she was one of the most industrious and musically eclectic pianists of her generation, and she is an artist greatly respected by her fellow pianist colleagues. This is Jed Disler, and you've been listening to The Piano Maven, your friendly podcast guide to piano recordings. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to being with you for our next episode.